Hello DStars, my name is Fonnesbech. I'm head of IP at Leverage, and I'm here to talk about building game IPs and brands, the 10 most common mistakes or traps. So let's start here. What is an IP? What's a brand? What's a game? How do we even talk about these things? So the example I like to use is IO Interactive, who are based here in Denmark. They made the Hitman series, they made the Mini Ninja series, they made a whole bunch of different series of games. But when they sold the company to Square Enix, the rights to that character were more than 65% of the value of the entire company. So what is that all about? So of course there's a great game at the core of it. That's the heart of everything. But there's also a character who has a specific emotional journey that millions of people have gotten to know. And that character is ownable in a court of law. So that's really the heart of the IP. It's the emotional attachment to this ownable asset. And outside the game, there's the brand, which is how do you communicate that experience and the IP to the market? How do you position it, make it different enough from the competitors, make it stand out, but not stand out so much that it's weird, and so on. So these two things are the things that we have been working on. So as I said, we're consultants. We've worked with, 30 plus companies over the last 6 years. Early projects, late projects, big ones, small ones. We've worked with Bandai. We've done 4 projects with PlayOn. We're on our 2nd project with Supermassive right now. And basically we're 3 founders. So I'm the head of IP. I look at the things I just mentioned, the tentpole character, the emotional journey, the ownability, and so on. And then there's David. He is head of brand. So he's looking at how do you strategically position the product in the market regarding competitors and how do you appeal to the right people and so on. And Gerard is our head of visual, who really bridges these two things because the visuals, of course, carry over from the IP into the brand. And yeah, that's what we do. So let's get started. 10 most common mistakes or traps that we encounter when we're working with companies out there in the world. Trap number 1, or 10, is that we meet a lot of companies that underestimate the need to build long-term value. So for most game developers, the world looks like this, right? You want to make a hit game, and that's all we can think about. The challenge is that once we get it, we tend to realize that that wasn't actually what we needed. What we needed was an entertainment property, because a property lasts. It can move on to the next game. It can move into other media. It builds value over time. It builds a fan base over time, and all of that is good if you have a number of employees on your payroll. The problem is, of course, that if you go that way, then the hit game is just really the first milestone. So there's a few other things you need if you are to make your game into an entertainment property. And that is things like a tentpole character like the Hitman, a repeatable emotional journey that people want to do again and again, a brand that's actually positioned in the market and differentiated and appealing, and so on. So about 2 years ago, we realized that pretty much all of the games industry has the same problem. And the problem is what it says up there, is there's no pre-production on IPs and brands. So we're great at doing pre-production on the gameplay or the technology and so forth. But what the IP is actually about, what the emotions we're aiming for, who is the main character, how are we going to position it in the market, there seems to be an expectation that that will emerge along the way. And the sad secret is that it often doesn't. So what you end up having is that you end up having 3 to 5 years of game development, and then you have 3 months of IP and brand panic. And then you tend to stumble into the market with whatever you manage to jam together. So that's not a great way to approach what is, in fact, an entertainment product. So what we're basically doing with most of the companies we work with is helping them to develop an IP and brand vision as early as possible. It can be done after you have a hit, but it's sometimes very difficult. So think of it if you have dedicated fans and you're now trying to reverse engineer a tentpole character into your game, just think about how they would react. Not always very well. So common trap number 9, making games about things. So we strongly recommend characters. So the thing is, you have to have a great game. That, no question. We would never question that. That's what it's all about. But once you have it, you have to start asking yourself, are you also creating an emotional connection or relationship with the audience? And it's really about what the emotional core is and how it is grounded in the reality of the audience. Is it about things, magical items, portals, worlds, money, gold, credits, gems? These are things. And that's not really what causes emotions. What causes emotions is relationships and conflicts between characters. So, yeah, that's a different way of thinking, right? Now it's not just the gameplay, it's also about who is the character we're playing and what are his or her relationships and conflicts with all the people and creatures and kingdoms around him or her. So a good example to use here is Game of Thrones. You could say it was about zombies, which are kind of things, or you could say it was about dragons, or you could say it was about, all the nations of the world have to band together to avert climate change. But this is not where you connect. This is not, why Game of Thrones became a global phenomenon. The place where you connect is the human story. And in Game of Thrones, that's all about dysfunctional families. It's about a dwarf who isn't being respected by his father. It's about a girl who doesn't want to do girly things, but wants to do the sword stuff. It's about another girl who gets into one bad marriage after another, and so on and so on and so on. Even when you move into the other kingdoms, they're all, examples of dysfunctional families. There's one where a teenager is still breastfeeding, and there's another one where there's an old man with 20 wives, and so on. So it's almost like a tour of bad families. And that is something people can relate to. Even if you don't have a bad family, I'm pretty sure you've heard of one. And think about this. Two of the most distinctive worlds ever designed, Avatar and Dune, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars spent designing fauna and spaceships and ecosystems and costumes and whatever. And what's on the posters? The characters. So think of it like that, right? The human connection in your game, and particularly in your IP, is the characters. And if you just look at a quick tour of, female heroes, heroines in action gaming, and they're super distinct, they're super emotional, they each have their own unique attitude, and they're ownable in a court of law. Trap number 8, underestimating uniqueness and relatability. So, a tentpole character is a big job. So there's a tendency to, let's just design a character, and then slowly you get used to it and it ends up being that character. I think you should be looking at your tentpole character as a separate project with its own budget and its own process. Because it really needs to be beloved in the end. It needs to be something people develop an emotional relationship to. It also needs to be relatable, so we need to recognize our own feelings in that character. And finally, it needs to be unique enough to be ownable. So if you look at just these 4, you can see all of those things, right? Lara Croft is still looking for her father in the ruins, and we recognize those emotions. She's unique because there's still those 2 guns and the costume and so on. Harry Potter, ownable, no question about Spider-Man. You just have to look at him to know exactly who he is. But even though he's fighting superheroes, he's also relatable, right? He has a girlfriend, he has family he's taken care of, he has a bad job, all these things. So it's a combination of all these things. So uniqueness, you need that if you're going to be ownable. And relatable, you need that if you want people to connect with it. So there's a number of factors here to get used to, and that's why your character should really be a project on its own. Common trap number 7 that people fall into, not integrating the IP and the gameplay. So what we see a lot is that the gameplay will sort of set the agenda, right? And you get to certain levels and you level up or you complete a mission or whatever. And then, there's some story tagging along. You really need to integrate these two so that the turning points in the gameplay where you level up or progress or whatever stacks with the turning points in the story. So that when something decisive happens in the story, it happens right where you level up or right where you complete the mission and so on. Sounds obvious, but actually quite often we don't see enough of it. Another thing we don't see enough of is having a dense story. So think of a story as a series of questions that are unanswered and create tension. So if you look at this, there's a lot of arcs there. And each arc is basically like a question that's been asked. And we want to progress to get the answer. So if this was Lord of the Rings, the big purple one going all the way to the end is, will Bilbo destroy the ring? Or will something start? So when that one is answered, the story is over and we can leave. But beneath it, there's a number of other arcs that keep our interest in the short term and medium term. So there's all these questions layered on top of each other, and we're progressing to get them answered. And when we get one answered, there needs to be more already there to keep our attention. And that's actually quite an engineering job. And this is where the writing becomes a little more than just, hey, make a mission work. So a thing that we often give as feedback is simply that there is not enough story. It may be long enough, but there aren't enough arcs to keep it dense enough to keep our interest and to keep us emotionally involved. Common mistake number 5, or trap, underestimating the universe. So the universe, of course, is what's all around the characters. Where did all these things come from? The castles or the spaceships or whatever. We're really talking about a fictional universe. And this is where you need to think that stories are not only about what happens right now, to me. It's also about what happened before the player got here, before the game even started. So you think about Middle-earth, for example, and you're not in doubt from the first moment you're there. It's a whole country which has history and the characters have been there for a long time. It's lived in. And that's really one of the secrets of making a world that really works. And of course, one of the pleasures of fiction, and especially fantasy and science fiction and so on, and games, is that you're slowly revealing along the way how all these things got to be the way they are. And a great example of this is Bloodborne, where you're really a minor player coming in after the bigger story was over. So there's all this with the churches and the blood curse and the gods that were buried on the street level and so on. All that happened before you got there. And as you're progressing into the game, you're slowly piecing it together. So it's almost as if they wrote a huge backstory. Imagine it like a Greek vase or urn. And then they smashed it and they put the pieces all jumbled together and spread them around the game. And it's actually up to you to piece it together. And people are still wondering today on YouTube, in hour-long sessions, how does this work? How is this god related to that one? And what happened when that church was attacked and so on? And this is how the real world is as well, right? We never get to the end of it. We never get complete information. So this is really a great way of creating both a sense of mystery, but also a sense of authenticity that this fictional world actually feels real. And if you want a masterclass, I can recommend Bone, which is a 1,500-page comic, which really does a great job of slowly unrolling and showing you that things are more complicated than you thought they were. It's great. I recommend it. Trap number 4. The writer is not managed by story experts. So this is a surprisingly common trap people fall into. And I think the reason that people fall into it is that they don't realize that writing is a craft that takes enormous skill, quite a lot of learning, and quite a lot of experience before you can master it. Pretty much like coding. I think people tend to think that because they can watch stories every night on TV, their feedback and knowledge is as good as anybody else's. But the truth is that a story is a complicated clockwork where every cog is there for a reason. Or it's like an engine. And if you mess with them, you'd better understand what happens when you mess with them, because otherwise they simply won't work. So the challenge we often see is that the writer is a relatively junior person on the team. And that means that they're they're too subservient. They have to do what their seniors tell them to do. Problem is that the seniors don't always understand how stories work. So we'll see a junior writer, male, female, quite often female, and she'll have spent weeks building this story engine that explains how the universe works and that, sets up these tension arcs through the game. And then the head of combat will come in, he owns 20% of the company, and say, hey, we should take this out and move it over here, and we should replace that with a rubber monkey because I think it's cool. And, he or she, the writer, can't really say anything because they could get fired if they're, not agreeing with their boss. And this means basically that the story is being taken apart and partially destroyed every day. And when you've seen this enough, it becomes quite actually a miracle that any game stories ever work. And the reason is, like I said, that the trap here is that people, the people running the writer, the people managing the writer, don't actually understand what the writer is doing. So my advice on that front goes two ways. Number one, the writer needs to educate the rest of the team on how stories work so everybody can talk about it. Or secondly, you need to bring in an external story editor because somebody needs to give the writer feedback, and that somebody needs to understand what the writer is talking about. Common trap number 3, getting close now. Not understanding your entertainment genre. So just to step back a moment, a genre is a type of something that has been proven to work, right? So we have genres of gameplay such as first-person shooter or real-time strategy or whatever. These are genres that after the first few games, everybody agreed, okay, that works. We know what constitutes a real-time strategy game or a first-person shooter. And the same goes for stories, right? There are genres such as gangster stories, or there are love stories, or there are Western stories. And as soon as I say gangster story, you know what to expect, right? You know that there's going to be crime, and there's probably going to be armed conflict, and there's going to be, a certain type of business. Often there's a family story as well. So just like with the gameplay, with the story, as soon as you mention the genre, it sets off a great deal of expectations in the audience's head. So the problem is that we often say, oh, is it gameplay or is it story? What's most important? And really, we should just put them next to each other. So we should realize that there's both a gameplay genre and a story genre, and we need to understand both. So we can change the gameplay genre on the left up there from a first-person shooter to a real-time strategy game, and it completely changes the experience. But the same happens on the story side, right? If you change from a gangster story to a Western or a love story, that's very different. So you can have a first-person shooter that's a Western, or you can have a first-person shooter that's a gangster story, or you could conceivably have a first-person shooter that was a love story. You could flip it, and it's a real-time strategy game that's a gangster, or it's a real-time strategy that's Western. So yeah, these things are interchangeable, but of course, it's not unimportant what you exchange. And what you need to understand, of course, on the story side is that these shared structures and stylistic elements and so on that go into a Western, cowboy hats, horses, it's probably about civilization building and they're fighting over land and things like that. You can't just mess with them without messing with people's expectations. So just as I have certain expectations for a first-person shooter, I have very clear expectations for a Western. So yeah, if you really want to, move towards the mainstream, you need to understand the expectations you are setting up, and you need to deliver on them. And I can demonstrate this like this. I found this poster online. It hasn't been made. There's only 3 Godfather films, but let's imagine there was a 4th. Now, as soon as you see this poster, as I said, you have very clear expectations. So if I add 2 words, I can completely screw that up, right? Godfather Part 4, Robot Apocalypse. That's not a movie I would go to see. Why not? Well, because, it's going to be terrible, isn't it? I thought it was going to be about family. I thought it was going to be about crime. But now there's robots. Doesn't work. But games do this all the time. And they probably shouldn't. In fact, it gets so bad sometimes that, we actually see that even though the gameplay genre will be the same all the way through, the story genre will actually change from level to level. So this was actually a client we had where it actually starts in one genre, then it moves into another genre, then it moves into a third genre, and so on. And if that's an art house project, that's actually pretty cool because you're really messing with people's expectations and you're really challenging them and you're really forcing them to think. But if you're aiming for a big mainstream audience, that's a really bad idea. And I'll tell you why. It's because art and entertainment works pretty much like technology in that there's a very small audience on the far left over there that really like to be challenged and that really like new things. And they don't really care if it completely works or not. They just want the new stuff. And in tech, that's the innovators. In entertainment, that's the art house audience. And it's only 2.5% of the total market. So if you're really challenging people's expectations, you should expect to be down there in audience size. And the same goes for the way you brand yourself. If you're going into early access and you have your early innovators in and you're really happy with them and you start to build the brand for them, it's going to be very difficult to move to the mainstream market because their expectations are completely different. And the problem is that the further you get into the mainstream market, the less rational the purchase decision becomes. So, when we're back to the genres, while the early innovators and art house audience, the 2.5%, they don't mind you messing with their expectations, the big green audience really want to get exactly what they ordered. So if they see it's a gangster story, it better be a gangster story and there better not be robots in it. So this was trap number 3. You need to understand the entertainment genre you're working in because the expectations will kill you. Now, trap number 2. You're starting the brand conversation too damn late. And this goes back to our discovery here that there's basically no pre-production on IPs and brands. And it's a really big problem. On the one hand, it's all about, getting your vision ready so that you're building a clear emotional experience and all your different departments, sound, level design, animation, visual design, all of it. They all need to be working towards the same goal because emotions are tricky, right? Everything needs to align. And the same goes for the brand, right? If you have a publisher or an investor and you want your marketing to have enough time to prepare, you need to build a brand. You need to know ahead of time what you're trying to build. You need to know which emotions you want to have in there and so on. So a lot of people are worried that when the brand people come in, they'll slap something completely different on top of the game and it will be marketed badly. And yeah, that happens. But if that's happening, then you've got the wrong brand people. Because the brand should really be rooted in the artistic intent that your game is built on. There should be a clear line between your gameplay and the emotions and the IP, all the way out to the brand design and all the way out to what happens in the marketing. But that means at an early stage, you need to think about what your vision is. You need to have a strategy. You need to take a look in the market at what's the competitive landscape and how do we want to position, how do we differentiate, and also how do we create a creative impact, both inside the game and in the brand design, so that this thing stands out while still appealing to the right people. And mostly that will mean you should be bringing in specialists. Your own people will be too close to the game to communicate it to strangers. And we often see that the local, the concept artist working inside the company ends up making the key art. And it feels great for the people inside the company, but for a total stranger, it's usually quite confusing because they're not getting the communication they need. But when it works, the brand visuals are really, they're taking the core of the IP and they're amplifying it. So you really see it right away. And it appeals to the right customers. So the people who will find your gameplay and your story engaging will be engaged by your key visuals and your marketing and your logo. And there's a bunch of emotions and personality and gameplay that can all get into that brand design. It needs to stand out. It needs to communicate a lot right away. And it needs to be consistent so that every touch point people meet your game. Is it marketing? Is it a conference? Is it merchandise? Is it different kinds of marketing? It all needs to be consistent, because otherwise you're not building familiarity, and that's really what you want. When it works, you can own a position in the market. And that's why there's not that many Hitman games around, because they own that position in the market. And if you don't, then you're really competing on features like everybody else. And with hundreds of games coming every week, you don't want to be competing on features. A good game is just not enough anymore. Finally, the trap number one that we see people fall in, the mistakes that they make again and again, is that they have nothing to say. And, but it's just a game. We just want to entertain. We just want to engage people. Well, that's fine if you only want to make a game. But if you also want to make an IP and a lasting brand in the market, then it needs to have something at heart. And so you need to figure out what the purpose of the experience is. You need to understand that we're in entertainment, and entertainment is about working with the values and conflicts and emotional mess that it is to be a human being. And you need to figure out what it is you want to say as an artist. Here are some examples from reasonably well-known projects. And it's not just about being artsy. If you don't know what you want to say, then all the hundreds of thousands of creative decisions that you're going to be making will be pointing in different directions. The sound will be presenting one thing, and the level design another, and the character design a third thing, and the story a fourth thing. You need all of this to be coherent. You need it to build resonance between every element so that you really make an impact emotionally. And that's all about understanding your own artistic project from the start. And it means, of course, that your IP needs to have a purpose. And finally, on that note, we strongly recommend that you actually believe it. So, as you probably know, I'm sure you're aware of, the internet is the biggest bullshit detector ever invented. So, yes, there's a lot of misinformation, but if you're trying to build an IP that connects strongly with people and that lasts for years while you're building your company and while you basically just get happy because you build something that lasts, you need to believe it. And that's it. Those are my 10 most common mistakes or traps. They're all here. My email is bottom right here. I also hang out at a Facebook group called The Player of Games. And you're very welcome to email me or join me there. Okay, thank you DStars, and have a great day.